scientific method while, sorry, I'm just getting myself organized here, while talking about an actual study, kind of, sort of, that we did and are doing. Okay, so here are the different steps of the scientific method. We talked about defining the problem, which would involve looking at the literature, certainly making at least informal observations. We talked a little bit about hypotheses and theories. These are the potential hypotheses that would direct the study that we're doing for this class, for this exam, as an example. When we test a hypothesis, we have to have good measures of the variables that we are attempting to study. So validity and reliability are a couple of criteria that we need to be aware of. And then we talked about these. This is kind of where we left off, I believe. We talked about types of psychological research. All right. So let me say, I think I had at least introduced these, but it's not a bad idea to kind of go through them again. Well, I think I had only talked really about experiments up to this point. So just to remind you that an experiment is a very particular type of research study designed to determine cause and effect. So when we're trying to determine cause and effect, we're probably going to use an experimental design. Now, to contrast that with the non-experimental research, so when it says non-experimental, that means we're not really trying to establish cause and effect for whatever reason. Sometimes we just simply can't. And sometimes maybe that's not even our goal. So two types of non-experimental research is descriptive research. So descriptive research is where you are taking your variables and you are simply describing them. You're not trying to establish a relationship with anything. You're simply describing the variables. So for example, I could look at the number of freshmen, sophomore, juniors, and seniors in this class, okay? And I could lay that out. I could look at the number of people from different states in the United States, different countries in the world, and I could look at that. The data that I would present for that would be simply descriptive. It's not establishing any connections with anything else. It's simply describing the situation, all right? Now, when we talk about correlational research, what we're attempting to do here is describe a relationship, not a cause-effect relationship, because we don't establish cause-effect relationships with correlation, but we are trying to see if there is a relationship. So for example, there is a correlation between, all right, well, let me put it this way. There's a correlation actually between the number of churches in a city and the number of murders committed in that city. Okay, so when you have lots and lots of churches, and if we look at the number of murders, that's also going to be high. If we look at another city and the number of churches is lower, the number of murders generally is going to be lower. All right, that's a correlation. Now, it's not, now when I say that, the first thing that probably came to your mind is, well, how could that be? Because what you're probably doing, which is what all of us as human beings do, is you're starting to think cause effect. I'm not saying that churches cause murders, okay? Not at all. I'm simply saying there's a relationship. The more churches, the more murders. There's actually a third variable that probably explains that relationship. Anybody have a guess as to what that other variable would be that explains the relationship between churches and murders?
Population.
The amount of people moving in.
Population. Yeah, number of people. So when you have more people, you have more churches and you have more murders. You also have more ice cream stores and you have more street signs and you have more benches and you have more dogs. You know, these are all things that we expect. So the correlation is, again, just simply describing the relationship that exists, but it's not a cause-effect relationship. All right. Now, some relationships, again, are going to be cause-effect, but a lot of the ones that we're trying to do are not. And if we want to establish a cause-effect relationship, we have to do an experiment. All right. We can't just simply look and see whether the two things are increasing at the same time. Okay. Well, anyway, let me review this by talking about characteristics of experiments so we can kind of get that in our mind and contrast that with the correlational research. When we're doing an experiment, we generally talk about independent and dependent variables, okay? So an independent variable, that's the variable that you are investigating. And you manipulate that variable in some way and to see its impact on the dependent variable. So if I have a drug that I believe improves intelligence, okay, the drug is the independent variable and intelligence is the dependent variable. Why? Because the independent variable is supposed to have some impact on the dependent variable. What I manipulate, what I change to see if indeed that is the variable causing these changes in intelligence is the drug, the amount of drug, or whether you get the drug or not. So this is why we have in experiments what they call equivalent experimental conditions. This is where we have experimental groups and we have control groups, if you've heard those terms before. So if I want to, again, see if my drug will improve intelligence, then what I can do is I can get a bunch of people together and put them in my experimental group, and I can get a bunch of people together and put them in my control group. My experimental group, I give the drug to, because that's my independent variable. The control group, I don't. And then I compare the two groups, right? I compare the two groups to see which one has seen, if at all, an increase in intelligence. If I see an increase in intelligence in my experimental group, but not in my control group, then that's good evidence that the drug is causing the effect, if I've set it up that way. So this is why the type of research design you use really depends on the question that you're trying to answer. If it's a cause-effect question, then you're going to have to use an experiment, really, to answer that question, or variation on an experiment. Okay, so now let me ask you another question here. So let's say, back to my drug intelligence example. Let's say I have, just by chance, I have in my experimental group, I have all, what should I say? Well, let's just say all men in my experimental group and all women in my control group. All right. And then I see there's a difference between the two groups. What's the problem now with me saying that that difference is due to my drug?
Aren't you supposed to just like work on one group instead of both?
Well, okay, you're getting at there's a problem with the groups, right? If I have all men in one group and I have all women in another group, and there's a difference, well, could the difference be due to the drug? Certainly, but it might be due to the difference in groups. Now, I'm not saying there's a difference in the intelligence of men or women, but I'm just simply saying that's a possibility. Maybe a more realistic example would be, let's take a group of people who are college educated and put them in the experimental group, and the people who have never been to college and put them in the control group. And then I give them my drug and I see a difference. But again, the question is, can I really attribute that difference to my drug? Or is it to the inherent differences in the group? Kirsten, go ahead.
The control group has to be randomly picked, right? So it would just have to be completely random. Is that right?
Yep, that's exactly right. So what you're talking about here is this idea of equivalent experimental conditions. And the way we accomplish that is through what we call random assignment. I just typed that word into the chat. Random assignment is where we randomly assign people to experimental group and control group. Okay, so I have a group of individuals here, college educated, non-college educated, men, women, whatever. But instead of saying, well, I'm going to put all of one type in one group and all type in another, what I do is I just randomly, I could pick their names out of a hat. I could assign them numbers and use a random number generator. There's actually a number of ways to do that. But what that does is it gives me equivalent experimental conditions so that at least I can say with some degree of confidence that the differences between the two groups if I get one in my drug, is not due to the group's composition. It is due more likely to the independent variable that I'm studying. So that's important that we have that kind of equivalence when we can do it. Sometimes there are certain studies that we can't do this with, right? So like if I wanted to compare some new instructional technique that I'm using in my Psych 111 class, it's going to be really hard for me to randomly assign students to sections of Psych 111, right? Because you guys have your schedules that you're trying to follow. You have your own time frames and your work schedules and all that. It would be impossible for me to take a group of students, Psych 111, potential Psych 111 students, and say, okay, yeah, you're in section 28 at 10:15 and you're in section 30 at 3:15. It would really be hard for me to do that just for practical reasons, because you may not be able to make that kind of a schedule. So sometimes we can't do it, but when we can do it, we definitely should do it. And then the third characteristic of experiments is control of outside variables. So oftentimes what we're trying to do with an experiment is we are trying to control as many factors as possible. So let's go back to my drug intelligence example. Maybe what I would want to do for both of my groups is I would want to control their diet. Maybe I would want to control some of the activities that they engage in. Maybe I would ask them to, I don't know, at least keep a diary of the things that they have done, so that at least I can have some control, knowing that it's not outside things impinging upon my groups that are creating the difference. Maybe I find that my one group suddenly decides that they really want to get into exercise and they all start exercising, and my other group doesn't. Well, that has nothing to do with how I set up the groups. It just so happens that this one group started exercising. Well, that's a problem, for my study, because if one group's exercising, the other group's not, that could be explaining the differences, maybe. It's not that it automatically does, it's just that it could be. If there is an alternative explanation, it weakens the conclusion that you're coming to. And so we want to be able to eliminate as much as possible alternative explanations for the effects that we get. All right, so that's what we do with experiments. And with correlational data, that's going to look a lot different, because all we're doing is just seeing if there is a relationship. And we do talk about positive correlations and negative correlations, right? So positive correlations is where my two variables of interest, one increases and the other one increases as well, like the murders and churches. And then the negative correlation would be where one variable increases and the other variable decreases. So like the amount of time watching movies on Netflix, that goes up, and maybe your grades go down. All right, now that's a negative correlation, and there's probably a cause-effect relationship there as well. But yeah, that's a negative correlation. It's still a correlation. It's just that it's going in a different direction. All right, so correlational data just simply tells us that there's a relationship. Experimental data tells us that that relationship is cause-effect. And many times that's what we're interested in, is cause effect. Okay. Now back to the last one here. Let me go back to that last one, case studies and observation. Case studies are when you look in depth at one example of something that you're interested in, or you observe something very, very closely and you're taking data. So back in the 1950s, there was a psychiatrist who started working with a woman that he called Eve White. And that wasn't her actual name. And this woman came to him with a host of problems, but what he ended up documenting is that she was suffering from what we now call dissociative identity disorder, or multiple personality disorder, as it was known back then. It's one of the first documented cases of dissociative identity disorder. It was a case study. Now, this book that he wrote called The Three Faces of Eve was a case study. It was basically documenting the things that had happened with Eve, the issues that she had 3 separate personalities, and how these things were resolved. And if you're interested in that kind of stuff, they actually made a movie of that book called The 3 Faces of Eve back in the 1950s. But it is, again, initially started out as a case study, an in-depth look at one person's experience. So you can see with something like multiple personality disorder, which is relatively rare, hard to come across, hard to get groups of people with that kind of disorder together. Sometimes what we have is a case study to tell us more about that individual's experience. Now, we'll see that there are good things and bad things about that, but sometimes that's all you can do is just look at things very in depth. All right, so, and then the reason that we have the qualitative, quantitative distinctions on here is that a lot of times case studies are just qualitative in nature, meaning they're descriptive, they're narrative, they're talking about something. You don't have numbers being used to describe the results that you get. Quantitative studies have numbers. They have averages or percentages or whatever it is that you're using in order to describe or to, again, deal with whatever it is that you're dealing with. All right. Okay, we're going to actually come back to these types of research in a little bit, but that's just to kind of introduce them. All right, now getting back to our study. Remember, our study was looking at seat preference and looking at GPA and all these different kinds of things. So what I put up there, this is just some of the data, the raw data that I collected from the 2 classes. So each line in that chart represents one of you students and indicates what you put down, the cumulative GPA for your gender, for seats, for your personality. That's just how I code it, because I'm doing a quantitative kind of analysis, and so I need to have it coded in that way to do so. But of course, just the data itself is not sufficient. So this brings us to the next step of the scientific method called analysis decision making. Okay, so what I have to do is I have to analyze my data. So here, what I have are just some very basic data tables, again, on the data from the 2 sections of Psych 111. So you'll see there's gender, pretty evenly split actually in the classes, 52 to 48. There's the seat preference, so 34% prefer the front, 29% prefer the middle, 20% prefer the back, and no preference, about 17%. There's the GPAs mentioned there, and then based on the statements that you marked, I indicated you're introverted, extroverted, or ambiverted, and you can kind of see what that looks like too. Okay, now this is all a great example of, if I stopped here, okay, if I stopped here, this would be a descriptive study, right? Because that's all I'm doing, is I'm just simply describing. Now that's all interesting and good, but remember, that's not what my hypothesis was about. My hypothesis assumed that there was a relationship between gender and seat preference, a relationship between GPA and seat preference, a relationship between personality and seat preference. And so I can't stop here in analyzing the data. I've got to go a step further. So what I did is I used something, again, this is not important that you know, but I used a statistical procedure called chi-square in order to analyze the data. And again, don't worry about writing down chi-square. But you can see in that very first chart, this comes from a particular program that I used, that this is the cumulative GPA by seat preference. So you can kind of see mostly C's and D's and where they tend to want to sit across the board, and then the mostly B's and then the mostly A's where they kind of want to sit. And of course, as you eyeball it, it doesn't always tell you a whole lot. It tells you a little bit more than just the descriptive data. But I use a procedure called chi-square, and chi-square looks at the data as I've outlined it here and makes it a mathematical determination as to whether that data is significant or not. In this case, if you look down at the chi-square test, you'll see that Pearson chi-square with a number, and you'll see something called asymptotic significance on the other side there. What we look for in that last column is a number close to 0. The closer to 0, the more statistically significant the result is, meaning that it may be really meaningful. So if we look here, we see that it's not that close to 0.72 for the chi-square, meaning that well, let's get back to the meeting in just a moment. I'll say something about that in a sec. Let's look at the next data. This is gender. Okay, so I have a chart that looks a lot like the same one I showed you, but this time it's just male and female cross-tabbed with seat preference. And then you can kind of see how that looks. And if you look down at the Pearson chi-square, notice that that number is much closer to 0 than the prior one. So we have some differences here between the genders. Again, the cutoff point is usually 0.05. So that's 0.08, so it's not quite at the cutoff point. So we're not quite there yet, but certainly there would be some indications that we have some preferences that are impacted by gender. Okay. Now the next one here is personality. So that's the introverted, extroverted, and ambiverted. And again, I have the same kind of chart set up. And then if you look down, we'll see that I'm almost there. I'm almost at that 0.05 with that Pearson chi-square. The likelihood ratio is another statistical procedure that's actually below 0.05. But in any event, there does seem to be some indications that there is a relationship between personality and seat preference. Okay. All right, so now I make my decision. I've done all the work that I needed to do. I've got to decide, are my hypotheses supported or not? Let me go back to those original hypotheses for just a moment. Here we go. Whoop. Okay, so my first hypothesis, individuals who have higher GPAs tend to sit towards the front of the classroom. So based on the data that I got, I would have to say that most definitively that's not supported in these data. So this prediction did not hold true. This hypothesis has to be rejected. I did not show any support for this hypothesis based on the data. And the other one said women tend to sit towards the front of the classroom. It was a little better, but in the end, because of that kind of 0.95 criteria that I told you about, I would have to come to the same conclusion here. That again, the data is a little bit more supportive of that idea, but not supportive enough. Because remember, when we're dealing with about 100 people, some of this could just be random fluctuations. You know, it could be that I just happened to get in the two classrooms a higher proportion of women that like to sit in the front. That may not hold true if I were to do this study again with a different group. The lower that number is, the more likely it is to hold true if I were to do it again. The last one is probably the one that has the best support. So extroverted individuals tend to sit towards the front of the classroom. And when we look at that, the analysis tells us that, yeah, I'm going to cut myself some slack. I'm going to say, yeah, this hypothesis actually did tend to hold true. But let's look at the data again. Let me make sure I've going in the right direction. Okay. I got to go back to there we are, the personality, right? So what we would expect to see is more extroverts kind of at the front of the classroom and fewer extroverts at the back, right? And so 15, 9, 8. And then we would expect to see fewer introverts at the front and more at the back. And and the data goes in the right direction. See, we go from 3, 7, 9, and here we go 15 down to 8. And then the ambiverts seems to kind of go down as well. So there's probably some differences between these two groups and the introverted group. So yeah, looking at the data, that does seem to hold true to a degree. Okay. And so I make my decision. I say, yes, this hypothesis is supported. The other two I kind of have to throw out, but this one is indeed supported. Now, well, question for you then. So what kind of study did I do here? Was this experimental, non-experimental, descriptive, case study? Hey, actually, I have a poll. Let's do that. Let me put this poll up. All right. So the study that I just have described to you, go ahead and tell me what you think. Is this non-experimental, experimental? Just go ahead and put down whatever you think is correct, and then we'll see what the class says as a whole. Okay, just about everybody's voted. Probably need about 15, 20 more seconds.
I don't seem to see the poll anymore on mine.
If you,
Insane.
if you responded to it, then it would kind of go away. So anyway, it's okay if you don't quite get a chance to respond to it. Let's go ahead. I'm gonna go ahead and shut it down, and I'll put up the results. Here we go. There we are. Okay. All right. So the majority of the class, 42%, said that the study that I did was non-experimental correlational. That is correct. This is a non-experimental correlational type of study. Can somebody then articulate for us why it's non-experimental correlational? Ashton, go ahead.
I thought it was non-experimental correlational because we were looking at two variables and seeing the similarity between, or the relationship between the two variables with the survey that you conducted,
Okay.
or at least the way I saw it.
Okay. All right. Yared, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry about that. So I think it's well, I also thought that because, I mean, just like, is it Ashton?
Yeah. I think-
All right, so just like Ashton said, just like the correlation between those two variables. Not only that, but you weren't empirically going with each person, and it's not really a test or experimental because you're just asking a question that is very, very subjective to empirical evidence. You know, it's how are we feeling at the moment, and though there is a little bit of correlation to GPA, just like your hypothesis has not been totally supported, right? But the short study or the short observation. So that's why I think it's non-experimental. It could be, but it's really hard to, because it's a subjective term, because you're just asking questions to the people. It's like, what do you think? Instead of saying like, what is exactly what it is. I don't know if I'm making sense, but
yeah, you are. You know, you bring up an interesting point. Now let me just clarify one thing that you said though. The subjectivity of the results of the questions, which you are correct in saying it is subjective. Actually, let me stop the share right there for a minute. The subjectivity of the results, that's not what really determines whether it's experimental or non-experimental. But then again, it can certainly lead to different conclusions about the rigor of the study. It's more the design. It's more, I haven't done any manipulation, right? I don't have experimental groups and control groups. I haven't given anybody one thing and withheld it from another. I'm not sure how I could do that with this kind of a study, right? So let's take the personality of and seat preference. How could I do that experimentally? If I was to do it experimentally, I would have to get my groups together and I would say to some of them, okay, you're going to be an extrovert and you're going to be an introvert, right? Well, I can't do that. Personality is a variable that's already intact when it comes to the experiment or to the study. And so I can't manipulate that. If I can't manipulate the variable, it's not going to be an experiment if I can't manipulate it. I cannot manipulate your personality. Only your mind, maybe, but no, not your personality. But anyway, I can't manipulate your GPA. That comes intact. I can't manipulate your gender. At least not. Well, we won't get into that, but I can't manipulate your gender. I can't do any of those kinds of things. So it's not going to be experimental if I can't manipulate. It's not descriptive just because I did more than simply describe, right? I looked at a relationship between variables. And when I'm doing that, I'm doing more than simply describing. And then it's not a case study because case studies usually require one person. And if it's observational, it's me observing that person or persons. And that was not the case here. I didn't observe you being extroverted. I didn't even observe your seat preference. All I did is I gave you some questions to respond to. So yeah, so it's got to be non-experimental correlational as a result. Okay, well, let's look at, oh, Ashton, go ahead. Yes.
I just had a question now that we're talking about correlational. I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but those numbers that are in the asymptomatic significance, is that the correlational coefficients?
No, those are not. We're not actually using correlational coefficients for this particular study.
Okay.
Many times you would, but because of the nature of the data, without getting too much detail on this, because of the nature of the data, we use something different. But we could use it and would use it in other instances. But right now, we're not using it, that particular statistic, in order to accomplish our ends here.
No, I don't know if this is important to know, or if we'll talk about this in the future, but you know, I just saw the you know, what correlational coefficients help us to know in an experiment. But I didn't really understand how we can calculate the number.
Yeah, that is not something you would need to know really for this class.
Okay.
If you're going on into certain majors, you will eventually take a stats class, and that stats class will teach you about how you actually calculate something like a Pearson R, which is statistic. Right now, we're just talking about the design. So correlational can apply in two ways. It can apply to the design that we're using, and it can also apply to the analysis that we use to try and make our decision. So it's in both places, but we're just talking about the design, not really the statistic. So yeah,
thank you.
That goes beyond the scope of our class. Not that I wouldn't be glad to talk about it, but yeah, no, we don't want to talk about statistics right now. Okay, this last step, dissemination, publication. So once I've done my study, the question is, do I need to share it with others? Well, maybe. I could, since I found some possible results, at least with my last hypothesis, that might be of interest, but probably I'm not going to, just because, you know, it was just a quick study done with class. But if this was a real study, then one of the things that I would do is I would send it off to a journal. So we have, let me go bring up my chat here real quick. We have a term, and I'm just typing it into the chat, called peer-reviewed journals. And this is a common way that information from studies is disseminated. And what we mean by peer review is that I would write up this study that I did with all the particulars about it. And then I would send that off to the editor of one of these journals. The Journal of Personality and Social Psychology is one that's out there. The editor would then send my article to 3 experts in the field, 3 experts on seat preference if they're out there, 3 experts on personality if they're out there. They would read through my study, and then they would come to a conclusion about it. They would tell the editor, yeah, go ahead, it's great, publish it. It's okay, publish it if they do these revisions, or no, it's junk, don't publish it at all. So they'll come back with that decision, and then the editor will communicate that decision to me, the person who originated the study. If it's great to be published, then I don't have to do anything. If I got to be published with revisions, I have to revise based on the recommendations of that group. And if it's just simply not going to be published at all, I guess I go into my office and cry a little bit and move on to the next study. But in any event, that decision is going to be made by peers, other people in the field. And that's what we mean by peer review journals. So this is why I would not send it off to like People magazine, you know. it's a different kind of periodical. I wouldn't send it off to a newspaper. I wouldn't send it off to even you know, like Popular Science, you know, because those are different kinds of periodicals. They're popular ones, the kind that you can buy, you know, if you go into Albertsons or Walmart, you know, you can buy a lot of different magazines. No, you don't find the journals that I publish in those kinds of places. They're in libraries, and most of them are online these days. All right, so so just to review these, let me put the steps up here again. The steps of the scientific method. Any questions about any of these steps? Anything that still doesn't seem clear in terms of the process, or anything that I can review a little bit? Just want to kind of touch base on that, and before I move on to my next thing. Excuse me. All right, if we're all kind of basically okay with this process as I've outlined, I want to go back to types of psychological research for a moment. And what I want to do is I want us to take us through some actual studies and see if you can identify which type of research it is. Okay, so what I have here are some descriptions of studies. These are actual studies, by the way, that I've just pulled from the literature. I'm going to go ahead and let's start with the first one. All right, so I'll go ahead and just read this real quick. A national telephone survey on violence was conducted from November 1995 to May 1996. The survey sampled approximately 8,000 women, providing data on women's experiences with violent victimization. Study findings provide data on the prevalence and incidence of rape, physical assault, and stalking. Physical assault was found to be widespread among U.S. women, with 52% of those surveyed reporting physical assault in their lives and 1.9% reporting physical assault in the last 12 months. All right, so let me put that same poll up again. Okay, so which type of design is this particular study? Okay, about 15 seconds. Okay. All right, let's put the results up there. Okay. So the winner here is non-experimental descriptive. I was pleased to see very few people put down experimental. It's definitely not experimental. It's not a case study. So can somebody tell me why this is not a case study, even though the word study is in the description? Why is this not a case study?
It's studying more than just like one person or a small
Yes.
group of people.
Yeah, and it's based on numbers. Remember, if it's case study, a lot of times that's just going to be a description of things that are happening, not a report of the different numbers. This is 8,000 different women, so it's definitely not going to be a case study. Why is it probably not non-experimental correlational?
There's not like a specific thing that's, correlating the two things. It's not like you have two different things, just one set of people.
Okay. We're not looking at a relationship between a couple of variables, are we? All we're doing is simply describing some variables, and that's all we're doing. So yes, it is indeed non-experimental descriptive. Okay, good. Let's try another one. This study investigated the use of a hands-on laboratory program as a means of improving student achievement towards science and increasing student achievement levels in science knowledge. Students were randomly assigned to either the experimental condition, hands-on lab program, or controlled condition, standard science class. The findings showed that students who had regular laboratory instruction, A, scored significantly higher on the objective examination of achievement in science knowledge than those who had no laboratory experiences, B, exhibited a moderate positive correlation between their attitude towards science and their achievement, and C, scored significantly higher on achievement in science knowledge. All right. So with that, let me put here, yeah. Okay. So which type of design is being used in this particular study? Okay, I'm going to wrap this up in about 15 seconds. All right, let's put the results up. Okay, all right, very good. This is indeed an experimental study. Somebody want to tell me why this is experimental? There's some key words in, let me stop the results here. There's some key words in that description that would tell you that it's experimental.
Does hands-on lab program, experimental condition.
Okay, so yeah, we have an experimental condition and a control condition. Right? Those are two words that should trigger that. Dakota says randomly assigned. Randomly assigned, yes. That also tells us we're dealing with an experimental study. So they are looking at a cause-effect relationship as a result of these changes. And so remember, some of the kids get the hands-on lab, and some of the kids don't, and that's being determined by the experimenter. So Cami said control. This is all part of the experimenter controlling things. Okay, very good. Let's look at another one here. The purpose of this study was to investigate the relation between marijuana use and psychotic symptoms in individuals. A relationship between the use of marijuana at an early age and later psychotic symptoms during adulthood was found. All right, so again, which type of study is this one? Okay, let's go ahead and we'll end that poll. Okay, I do understand why some of you may have put down case study because it doesn't have a lot of detail in it. But I'll tell you, this is not a case study because it's not just looking at one person. Probably I need to include a few more details to not throw you off there. But this is indeed non-experimental correlational. So they're looking at a relationship. So why would I not use an experimental design to investigate this particular question? Why can I really not use an experimental design?
Because the people you're studying already have like used marijuana. You're not introducing it to them.
Right. And could I do that? Could I actually introduce that to my subjects?
Not legally?
Or ethically, actually. Yeah, see, in order to do an experimental design, I would have to get my group of subjects together and I'd have to say, okay, you guys, you're going to use marijuana for a while and you're not. And then later on, we'll see how psychotic you are. Though there will be some people out there who would probably be willing to volunteer for that study. From an ethical standpoint, I really can't do that. We'll talk more about ethics probably a little later, but yeah, there's some ethical issues. So this is, yeah, more correlational. Okay. Okay, let's see. Oh, stop the share results. Okay. All right, the subjects. Oh no, I've got to read the right one. Wrong screen. The relationship between marital status and psychological well-being was explored. Data from a large metropolitan Chicago sample are used to examine prevalence of depressive episodes in a group of adults divorced for at least 4 years. There appears to be an increase in depressive episodes with, each subsequent year after the divorce. This increase in depression may be mediated by greater economic problems, the perception that one's standard of living has deteriorated, and the lesser availability of close, confiding relationships. All right, so again, which type of study are we talking about here? All right, about 10 more seconds here. Okay, let's take a look. There we go. All right. So I'm very pleased that nobody put down experimental. Yeah, this is definitely not an experimental study. All right, so some people thought it was descriptive, correlational, observational. This is probably one that I would call correlational. And why? There's actually a word there. Let me get rid of this for a second. There's a word there that tells me that this is probably correlational. What's that word or words?
Relationship.
Relationship. The relationship between marital status and psychological well-being. All right. So we're looking at a relationship between two variables. That tells us it's probably correlational, not simply descriptive. And it's probably not going to be a case study because, again, it's involving several people, right? So case studies generally are just one person. Now, if we had just taken one person, let's say we had taken Joan, and we said, we're going to look at the trajectory of Joan's life after her divorce for 4 years and see how things go for Joan, then that would be a case study. And it would say that specifically. We're looking at one person, we're describing what happens to her as she goes through this divorce. And then there are some studies that could do that and would be useful. But this particular one is correlational. Okay, next. The subjects were 9 to 11-year-old children. Subjects were admitted to a clinical research center on 2 evenings, 7 days apart. On both admissions, the subjects ate dinner at 1700 hours, went to bed at 1900, and were awakened at 7:20 the next morning for breakfast, served between 0800 and 0830. Another group of children of the same age range ate dinner at the same time, went to bed at the same time, but at 7:20 the next morning did not receive breakfast. The children engaged in quiet activities until about 11:15, at which time 2 psychologists, blinded to the treatment, administered a series of behavioral tests. The consequences of the morning fast included slower stimulus discrimination, increased errors, and slower memory recall. All right, so what kind of study is being done here? Okay, about 15 more seconds. All right, let's go ahead and put it up here, share the results. All right, very good. Most of you put down the correct answer, which is it is indeed experimental. Why is it experimental? Somebody want to tell us what led you to that conclusion, that it's experimental?
There weren't a lot of like variables until the one thing where they just didn't receive breakfast for one group.
Okay, so that always is a clue. One group doesn't get something that the other group got. Maddie, go ahead.
Another factor was that they said that the psychologists were blinded by the treatment. And
Okay.
usually that's like blind studies or double blind studies. This isn't a double blind study. But
Yeah, oftentimes, if we're talking about blinded studies, usually we're talking about experimental control and manipulation. And so, yes, oftentimes that is the case. So yeah, that's actually, we haven't talked about that yet, but you're right, that does signal an experimental study. Well, I'll say a little bit more about that probably on Friday. Okay, very quickly here, we've got just a couple minutes. Let me just put up this last one, last case. The report attempts to delineate certain residual learning capacity of HM, a young man who became amnesic in 1953 following a bilateral removal in the hippocampal zone. In addition to being able to acquire new motor skills, this patient shows some evidence of perceptual learning. He also achieves some retention of very simple visual and tactual mazes in which the sequence of required turns is short enough to fit into his immediate memory span. Even then, the rate of acquisition is extremely slow. Okay, I won't do the poll this time, but does somebody want to tell me what kind of study is this?
Case study.
There we go. Yeah, this is a case study. Why? Because we're just looking at one person, HM, a young man who became amnesic. This is actually a very famous case study in psychology, and we will actually be talking about HM next week a little bit. All right. Okay, we're going to stop here for today. When we come back then on Friday, we'll kind of wrap up the last few topics in research methods and see where that takes us. In the meantime, you guys have a very good day, and we'll see you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
thank you.
You
Thank
betcha.
you.
See you later.